So in other words, Israel will find their salvation in the rock. Does that jar your memory at all? Jesus is the rock of our salvation. So they're going to flee to this prepared rock city, this place in modern-day Jordan, and apparently God will have it all ready for them. I think it's interesting that in 1994, 13 years ago, Jordan and Israel signed a peace treaty. Good timing. This now makes it feasible for Petra to become the likely refuge for the fleeing Jews at the midpoint of the tribulation because of this peace treaty in 1994. 3 years later, the Petra National Trust was formed. The USA Today publication ran an article on September 17th talking about how they're going to now form this Petra National Trust. It's a reclamation project. Petra is one of the 7 wonders of the world. It is a massive place. My wife and I, the very year that they formed the Petra National Trust, were able to visit Petra. I have family that live in Jordan, and my cousin took us there, and we got to see it. We only had one day. It was not near enough because of the enormity of the size of this place. There are theaters, temples, banks, tombs, houses, all carved out of this red rock. And so you can go today to the Petra National Trust website, petranationaltrust.org. It's a society for the preservation of the antiquities and the cultural heritage and the environment of Petra. In other words, God is preparing, perhaps vis-a-vis the Petra National Trust, a place in this rock city for the Jews who will need it, I believe, very soon, actually. Here's another thing. Petra is only 95 miles away from Jerusalem. I don't know how far it is from this side of the island to the other side of the island, but it can't be maybe that much farther or that much closer. Gives you an idea of how easy it would be and how feasible it would be for them to flee to this rock city. John the Revelator recorded in chapter 12, verse 6, saying of the woman, speaking of Israel, that she would flee into the desert to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for, get this, 1,260 days. In other words, 3.5 years. Petra is an incredibly secure place. To get into the crater, you have to go through a narrow canyon about 30 feet wide at the widest point and 12 feet wide in many places, with a rock face between 200 and 1,000 feet high. The entire city can be easily secured by about 15 soldiers who would march on the ridges above the narrow entrance into the city. When my wife and I were making our way down into this entrance, you actually have to either go in by foot, by camel. I'm ashamed to say when we were in Egypt and Israel and even in Jordan, my wife was always the one riding the camel. You can't get me on a camel. I'm sorry. I don't know why. Have you ever seen such a ugly creature in your life? I'm sorry. I'm sorry for any of you that might have a pet camel. But I'm telling you, they just are rude. But you either have to go in by camel, by a small vehicle, or on a horseback in order to actually get in. Now, that's what you see when you first go in. This is on the other side. That's the entrance, to give you an idea of how secure the city is and the entrance is. John records a few verses later in chapter 12, very specifically, something that has led many to believe that it has to be Petra. He says, when the dragon, speaking of Satan, saw that he had been hurled to earth, he pursued the woman, speaking of Israel, who had given birth to the male child, speaking of the virgin birth, Jesus the Christ. Verse 14, the woman was given the 2 wings of a great eagle. Put that in your hip pocket for just a moment. That she might fly to the place prepared for her in the desert, where she would be taken care of for a time, times, and half a time, 3.5 years, out of the serpent's reach. Then from his mouth the serpent spewed water like a river to overtake the woman and sweep her away with the torrent. But the earth helped the woman by opening its mouth and swallowing the river that the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. Well, this is really interesting. You know how in Arizona they get those flash floods and they fill up those crevices in those rock formations? That's the way it is in Petra. In fact, the water levels can rise so high and with such a velocity that it's actually unsafe, and it creates a flooding dynamic. And this is what many Bible teachers believe John is talking about in Revelation, where Satan creates this flash flood, if you will, and tries to destroy Israel, but God opens up the earth where the waters are able to then go down and recede, thus saving them from the enemy. Interesting, when you go to Petra, you see all of these lines in the rock from the water levels at one time being so high. Okay, take the eagle's wings out of your hip pocket, because the very first, and one of the most magnificent, if you can get an idea of how enormous this thing is, this is what you first see when you go in. See this? That's 2 people right down there. That little speck, that's how massive this thing is. See this up here? Those are what are left of eagle's claws on both sides of this. Some believe they call it a treasury. It's actually a temple. Well, when we were there, I asked the tour guide, who was a Muslim, why the eagle's wings, which would have towered over this entrance, are gone. And he said because the Arabs thought that there was a treasure in there, and so they basically, destroyed them trying to get at this, elusive treasure. But originally, and they may have structured this and rebuilt this in their reclamation of this, site. But if you can just imagine how these eagle's wings would have towered over this entrance. And by the way, there's eagles all over this place. So many believe that the reason why it has to be Petra is because of John's allusion to that with an eagle's wings, they will, be protected. And some have thought, well, it's the United States, which is the symbol of the bald eagle. It's the United States carrying Israel to Petra. I suppose that's possible, but I believe it has to be Petra. I don't know if the United States is involved in this, but there were these 2 eagle's wings and these 2 eagles at the top of this massive structure. But the eagle has significance in the scriptures as it relates to delivering God's people from their enemies. So, and by the way, the eagle in typology is a picture of deity. So this is God's way of saying, this is what I'm going to do, and this is how I'm going to do it, and this is where I'm going to do it. A Bible teacher by the name of W.E. Blackstone a number of years ago was so convinced that Petra would be the place in which the Jews are kept safe, he purchased hundreds of thousands of Hebrew New Testaments, and he underlined passages like in the one in Matthew 24 and then the one we just read in Revelation 12, and left them in earthen jars throughout Petra, so when the Jews get there, the Bibles will be waiting for them. When we were there, I kind of looked for them. What are you looking for? Oh, nothing. I didn't find any, but interesting.